Let's go ahead and jump in, and we'll try to finish today. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know we'll have some more folks roll in. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm actually going to have to pop out at about 10 o'clock. One of the things we started doing last year, and we've continued this year, it's a really sweet thing. Second graders come into the service. We offer classes for first grade and below during the worship hour, so second graders formally come into the service. Now, obviously, kids can come in before then. They can come in whenever they want with their families, but we don't offer anything for second graders and above. So if they've not been coming to the service, once they hit second grade, they're now in the service. And so we try to pick a time in that sort of first fall semester of them in the service to pull them out of Sunday school. And so during the first half, we're giving them some breakfast, and Pastor Scott is going to talk to them and walk them through. Here's all the pieces of our service, and here's what we do and why we do it, and then I think Kevin's going to talk to them some about the scriptures, and we gave them all, or given them all this morning Bibles. I've signed them. Kevin signed them. Their parents are in that room right now signing a note to them, and so Kevin's going to talk to them about why we read the Bible, what is it, and encourage them to use their Bible in service. And so I'm supposed to go in at about 10:05, something like that, and sort of do the final touches and pray with them, and then present their Bibles, and we take pictures in it. So we'll bring them up. We'll bring them up at the beginning of service today and just have Kevin pray over them. It's a really sweet thing, and it's a big deal for these kids they are sort of crossing a threshold, right? For some of them, they've not come into service a lot. Now they're starting to do that. We really want to encourage them to be in service. We've had people, most of the time it's visitors who come in and say, well, that's way too young for kids to be in the service. And I would say, well, you don't know much about what's going on in the school system then. Kids are learning a lot of stuff in second grade. They can certainly be in a service and learn to sit and listen, and we want to help them do that, and so parents can be useful in that. So this has been a cool idea. We started this last year, and the kids really, really loved it, and I think it's a fun way to sort of have a marker. I think we talked about in this class, maybe week 1 or week 2, is that we don't have enough sort of markers in our lives anymore that sort of set us one stage of life apart from another. So this is just a cool marker in their life. So I'm going to leave a little bit early, about 10 o'clock, and then Chris is going to take over for me. And what we're going to do in that back half is just sort of talk through. I'll have you break up into some groups with just the folks that are around you, and we'll talk through some stuff and facilitate some discussion for the last remaining minutes. We didn't get all the way through the week 5 stuff. I don't have the time to go super in-depth in that, so I will mention 1 Corinthians 11, 3 through 16, which is what we didn't get to last week. I mentioned that just briefly and sort of do the 40,000-foot view, and then we're going to jump on to get to what we need to get to today. So if you remember, we were talking about the foundations for male biblical headship in the church last week. We looked at the 1 Timothy 2 passage. The one we didn't get to was the 1 Corinthians 11, 3 through 16. So if you'll read that passage, it's Paul talking about, it's the head covering passage, right, where Paul's calling women to not pray or prophesy with their heads uncovered. And there's a lot of discussion about what in the world does that mean? Should women still be wearing head coverings today? There's a lot more that could be said about that. Any question you have about that, you ask Chris, and he'll answer your question to the fullest when we're done. Sort of Cliff Notes version is, one of the ways that as a woman in this culture you showed your submission to your husband and that you were under authority was to wear a head covering. That was just one of the ways you did that. So to be in the body and to be operating as a wife without your head covering was in many ways a scandalous thing. Now, head coverings don't function the same way for us now. You could wear a head covering and it doesn't necessarily signify that to other people. What could function in that way for us in current culture? Wedding ring, right? If you don't believe me, on your way to work tomorrow, go in front of your wife and take your wedding ring off and leave it on the counter and say, all right, I'm going to work today, right? And you just see how she reacts. And you can say, well, it's just a ring. What's it matter? She's going to pick your finger back up and she's going to put that ring on and say, no, right? It's just a thing, but it is a way that we symbolize that we are in a relationship, that we're in a covenant with somebody. And so Paul is not, I don't think Paul is giving a universal prescription for women to wear head coverings at all times and all ages. Though some have taken it to be that way. And so in some church cultures, women still wear head coverings. I'm totally fine with that. I'm not angry about that. I respect their desire to try to obey what Paul is saying. I think Paul's point there is that for them to not wear those head coverings was to be rebellious, was to sort of be out from underneath the authority of their husbands and of the elders. And so he's calling women to serve the church in a way that embraces their feminine identity, doesn't shun it, doesn't put it off to the side. That remember we've talked about there is a natural distinction between men and women. And so even when we serve in the body, we serve as men, we serve as women, however God has made us. So that's right. There's a lot more that could be said that I don't have time to say. That's the gist of the head covering section, is Paul is calling women to serve in submission to, one, their husbands, and two, the elders of the church, the leaders of the church, and to not act in a rebellious way. But that, even in that, Paul is saying that they're still expected to serve. Paul expects them to serve in the body, expects them to serve distinctly as women. And even though they have distinct purposes, men and women in the church, he says that men, in that text, he says that men and women are not independent of each other, that they still need each other, that men need women and women need men in the body, that we operate together. So that might muddy the waters more than it helps, but we're going to move on into week 6. Because I do want to get to some of these things, and then you'll talk about these a little bit as we work through them. So we've walked through the first 3 weeks, sort of moving towards a definition of biblical manhood and womanhood. What does it look like? What do the scriptures actually call us to? And then in these back half, we've talked about biblical manhood and womanhood in the home, and then in the church, and then this week is sort of the catch-all in the world, in the workplace, and in everywhere else. I think I've given you in your handout a quote from a feminist from 1971. Her name was Gloria Steinem. She's writing about sort of her vision of what the future would look like, and part of what she says is that she's looking forward to a society when she says we are talking about a society in which there will be no roles other than those that are chosen or those earned. Right? That this was sort of the feminist mantra, that they were looking forward to basically a genderless society in which there is no distinction between men and women, in which all things are open to all people, and there is equality of all things. Now, we have to say there are lots of ways that though men and women are distinct, there are lots of ways that men and women should be equal in our society. Correct? Right? That when you went to the polls last week, right, your vote didn't count for more than your wife's vote did. Right? It's a good thing for all citizens to have equal votes, right? If you get a job and you're doing, right, we think it's a good thing, equal pay for equal work, right? All things being equal, if it's the same job, then whoever does that job should be paid the same, whether they're male or female, right? That there are good things. You should have access to things like healthcare and education, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman, right? There are places in the world that boys are allowed to go to school, but girls are restricted from education simply because they're girls, right? We would say there are all sorts of things that are open to both men and women, even though they are distinct. But what we're looking for and what we're hoping to build is not a genderless society. This is what feminism has done, right? It has tried to say there is zero distinction between men and women, and so there is no real genders, and so therefore everything should be open to everybody, regardless. There are no feminine roles, there are no masculine roles. All things are for all people. Now that sounds to some of them like this beautiful utopia. What that means then, ultimately, in the sort of the outworking in just the real everyday life, is that has produced for us absolute chaos. Right? If you just think about the current culture that we're in, has this produced good fruits in our culture? Absolutely not. It has destroyed families and marriages. It has wrecked kids' lives. It has done a number to education, to the worldview of kids. Right? It has not produced good fruit. So this is what the world is saying. And I think part of this is they have seen the distinction between men and women as a competition. Right, that men are in competition with women. And so So if things that are good for men, therefore must be bad for women, and things that are good for women, therefore must be bad for men, that there is this competition. Now, I hope that you've seen what we've looked at all the way through, is that the Bible nowhere says that men and women are in competition. It's not about, who can be better, or who is the better gender. It's not about men winning or women winning, or men losing or women losing. That they're not in competition. They are complementary. They fit together. It's not about one being over the other. It's about these two distinct genders living up to the roles that God has called them to, fitting together for their good and for the good of the world, right? That this is part of human flourishing, is understanding our distinctions as men and women. When we think about how this plays out in the world, in the workplace and in the larger culture, most of what we're going to talk about, most of how we think about this, is a question of wisdom, not a question of black and white, right or wrong, right? That figuring out how to live in God's created world according to God's design and for godly purposes. Right? These are wisdom questions. Now, make sure we understand the difference between a wisdom question and a right or wrong question. Right? You probably grew up thinking that the hardest thing in life was going to be choosing between right and wrong. That's not the hardest thing in life, right? In general, the right and wrong categories are pretty easy. Right, the hardest thing in life is choosing between good, better, and best. It's figuring out what is the best thing. That these are wisdom issues. So, somebody give me what's an example of an issue that is not a wisdom issue. That is a really clear right or wrong. Right, good, godly Christians can't disagree about what you're supposed to do in this matter. Somebody just throw me an easy one. Murder, right? Right, it's not a wisdom issue. You can't say, well, I find that I think murder is acceptable. Right, that murder, we're talking about murder in the definitional sense. I think it's nice to say, I think we have to be clear to say murder and not the taking of a life, right? Because there might be different scenarios in which the taking of life would be justified. We can talk about that. But murder, right, the unjust taking of a life, that's not a wisdom issue. That one's really clear. We all have to pretty much agree on that one. And if you don't agree on that one, don't sit near me, right? I don't want to make you mad, right? We want that's not a wisdom issue. Now, what might be another issue that is a wisdom issue, that is not as clear, that is not right or wrong, that good, Bible-believing, Jesus-loving Christians might come to different conclusions on? Just war, right? What in that same category? What is just war? Is it a firm category? And if so, what criteria need to be met in order for a just war to take place? And how does that need to happen? And what are the goals? And when should you pull back? Right, all those. Right, this is the discussion people are having right now about Israel. What does it look like to try to wage this war in Gaza against Hamas in a way that is effective, in a way that's just, in a way that protects innocents? Okay, there's lots of people who need to read up on just war, and as they try to have these conversations, right? So that's one. We've talked about one in here. Should your wife work at home or should she work outside of the home? Right? We've talked about that. That's a wisdom issue. That's less right and wrong, and that's more good, better, or best. It's more looking at your context, looking at your motivations, looking at what God has called you to do. Somebody else. What's another one? What? Debt. You don't listen to Dave Ramsey then, I guess. No, right? There are good God-honoring Christians who disagree about the levels of what is okay to, what kind of debt is okay to take on. Can you take on debt at all? And if so, how much? And how do you do all those things? All right, so I want you to just to have those categories in your mind as we think through how does gender play out in the larger workplace and culture. Because not all of us are going to necessarily land in the same spot. There are other Christians who love the Lord and who read the same Bible you do and believe it and want to live faithfully that might land in different places, and that's okay, right? It doesn't mean that you have to hold your position any less, right? Paul says each man should be convinced in his own mind, right? You be convinced, you read the scriptures, but we hold these things looser, right? But because these are often questions of wisdom, not hard questions of right or wrong. So how do we move towards thinking about what this looks like in society? The first thing is we must consider our created dispositions. So part of what this means, we try to figure out what does gender look like in the broader culture and workplace, is remembering that wherever you go, if you are a man, you go as a man. Wherever you go, if you are a woman, you go as a woman. You're not genderless, right? And so Whatever job you have, whatever place you are in society, you are there as what God has made you, as either man or woman. And so we keep in mind these created distinctions that God has given us, these different dispositions. Those don't go away just because you take a certain job or you step into a certain office or role, that we each, even as men and women, are still created with different dispositions, right? All the same things still hold true. There is equality in God's image, but there is a difference in disposition. God has made men and women differently. He's given us different strengths, different weaknesses, different roles to serve. We've talked about this, but this is sort of a summary. You think about Genesis 2:15 and 18. Adam is to provide and protect. It's part of his disposition of how God has made him. Eve is a helper, right? In Genesis 3:9 and 20, Adam is called to responsibility, and yet we've seen Eve as a mother, right? That Eve is a nurturer, that she is one who cares for those that are around her. Part of this distinction that is seen in the world is often seen physically, right? I don't think this is a controversial statement. Generally, men possess a physical disposition and strength that is greater than women, right? It doesn't mean always, at all times, in all places, right? I went to a school in college that had a women's wrestling team. Everybody on that team could whoop me, right? all of them. I would not have messed with them. So I'm not saying all women are weaker than all men physically. That's not what we're saying. But generally, the way that God has made us, generally men have a different physical disposition than women, which should have something to say about the types of jobs that men take versus about the types of jobs that women take, right? Is it unjust that I think it's something like 95% of bricklayers are male? Is that unjust? Have we hurt the women by not opening up that job to them more? No, I don't think so at all, right? It's like we spent some time in Panama recently, a couple months ago, and what we would do during the day is the men, there were physical projects there. We were pouring a porch and doing some concrete work, and we had to bust up just a big pile of like old rock and old concrete and cinder blocks, and we just had some for like 2 days. We had sledgehammers and just busted rock for 2 days to get ready to put it into this patio that we were pouring. So the men worked on that during the heat of the day, and the ladies would work with our local partners and taught English, right? They worked with them. They wanted to learn English, and so they worked with them. At no point would it have been appropriate for me to go over and say, hey, Cheryl, I want to talk about vowels for a bit. I want you to come take my spot. You come swing the sledgehammer, right? No one there is saying, well, you patriarchal pigs, right? You are the ones that want to know. This is part of our physical disposition. It was right for me for 2 days to swing a sledgehammer, and to free the ladies up to do the less physical work, still work, just different types of work. So part of when we think about what does this look like in the world is we want to talk about equal pay for equal work. That's fine. I don't think it's a wise goal to say we want every field in the world, we want every job to be split 50-50 between men and women. I think that's really unwise, and I think that ignores the distinction between men and women. And I think there is a reason that some jobs lend themselves more to the physical nature of men, and some jobs, I think, lend themselves more to the feminine nature of women. Nursing, I think, is a great example. It doesn't mean if you're a man you can't be a nurse, but by and large, most nurses, I think, tend to be female. One, they're often naturally more comforting and nurturing than men. And again, doesn't mean that all men are. Doesn't mean that if you're a man and you're a nurse that's a bad thing, or you're in a feminine job. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that there are still differences in disposition between men and women, and certain jobs are going to lend themselves sometimes more to one or the other. We would say that's not necessarily injustice, that often that's just wisdom, right? That's a good thing. Think about the military. It's a question America feels like is always having to answer all the time, and often is answering, I think, in really unwise ways. Should women be put in infantry roles? Should women be put in the front lines of combat? Are you asking us? Yeah, I'm asking you. It shouldn't have to be, right? I think it says something about a culture when we're having to ask that question. When we're having to say, well, should we open up these roles to women? Again, I don't think that is because we hate women. Right? I don't think it's because we want to keep them from something fun, or we want to keep, right? I think, again, it should be part of our masculine disposition to say we want to put our lives on the line. We want to put ourselves on the front line. And again, even then, physically, there is a physical difference between female soldiers and male soldiers. And not to go down a rabbit hole, if you watch, even within the Marines within the last few years, they have had to adjust. They began with the same physical baseline. Everybody had to pass it, male or female. And then they figured out, if we want to get to the percentages of females in the Corps like we want, they began to adjust the physical requirements. Why? Because there is a physical difference between men and women, that we are not the same. And that is not a wrong thing, and we think that's a good thing. So understanding and keeping in mind these dispositions is at least part of the step we have to take as we begin to think through what does it look like for men and women to serve in different roles in the world. Number two, we have to consider our prescribed roles in the home and in the church. Right? So the Bible, I think, gives very few rules and boundaries about what our roles in the public square have to look like. The Bible is much more concerned about giving roles and boundaries for what those things look like in our homes and in the church. We have very specific instructions that we've talked through about what this looks like in the home and in the church. And then there are less boundaries, right? There are less specific prescriptions for public square. What that does not mean, though, is that then the public square is a free-for-all. Right, and we just, whoever thinks whatever, right? The Bible doesn't say women can't be in the infantry, so therefore let's just put them on the front line and see what happens. I don't think that's what wisdom would lead us to. I think we can look at the specific prescriptions that God has given us for the home and the specific prescriptions that God has given us for the church, and then we can use that wisdom to help us then to think about this third category, which is not the same as the church and in the home, but still is inhabited by men and women. All right, so we want to consider the specific roles that God has given us. So God, though Scripture doesn't give us a ton of boundaries or rules about the public square, still, at the same time, God's prescribed roles represent a formalizing of men's distinct created dispositions. He has given us distinct roles. So if you think about 1 Peter 3:4, when he speaks there about the wife submitting to her own husband, it calls there not to be adorned with all the outward adornments that would make one beautiful, but he says that what makes her beautiful is a gentle and quiet spirit, right? Though that instruction is specifically for a wife in submission to her husband, right? The call for a woman to clothe herself in the beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, teaches us something about femininity in general, right? That has application even outside of the original prescription that he gives us in 1 Peter 3. A husband's called to lay down his life for his wife in Ephesians 5, right? Though that is a specific instruction about a husband for his wife, it teaches us something about masculinity in general that then does have, I think, some bearing on how we play these things out in the broader space. So, again, I would argue one of the reasons that we shouldn't put women on the front lines is because men are called to lay down their lives. It is part of what we do. We put our lives on the line. We place ourselves at the front of danger for the sake of others that we might protect. I think that plays itself out immediately in the homes as men lay down their lives for the wives. I think it plays itself out in the church, as we talked about. Pastors are men laying down their lives for the bodies. They serve the body. And I think that plays out in the culture as men lay down their lives for the good of their fellow man, right? For human flourishing. That it is part of who we are as men. It gives us a distinct piece of masculinity. Does that make sense so far? All right, the next piece, number 3. As we think through these things, you have to consider your particular stewardships and responsibilities. What I mean by this is you need to, often when we're trying to navigate, what does this look like in the public square? The question becomes, well, as a man, can I take this job? Or as a woman, can I take this job? Can I serve in this role? Can I be in this office? As a woman, can I be a boss over men? Or as a man, is it fine for me to be a boss over women in the workplace? Right? We have these specific questions. I think one of the ways we do that is we sort of deal with the big rocks first, right? You deal with the non-negotiable. So if you're thinking through, what's that look like for you in the world? You have to first consider what are the non-negotiable duties that God has called you to. All right? So if you're a husband, what is one of the non-negotiable duties that God has called you to? To shepherd your family, right? Your wife and any kids that you might have, right? That is a non-negotiable. Whatever other area you might serve in, whatever other role or office you may step into in the public square, that is secondary to the non-negotiable that you have been called. If you're a husband, you've been called to serve that way, right? Let's just say you're not a husband, but you're a Christian man, right? What are some non-negotiables that God has called you to as a Christian disciple who's a man? I'm going to make you all go through Discover Buckron again. One, time in the Word, right? To read. What did you say? To serve in the church, right? You're to lay down your body for the sake of your fellow believers, right? You're to serve your body, right? You're to gather with your body, right? You're to be together, to read, to pray, to worship, to hear the word preached. You're to live out personal spiritual disciplines, right? You're to, if you don't have a wife and kids, that doesn't mean you don't shepherd. You have your own soul, right? You should be shepherding yourself. You should be leading yourself. Paul says he beats his body to bring it into submission, right? You discipline your own self to read the word, to pray, to seek the Lord, right? These are non-negotiables in your life that ought to then govern the things that might come after it. What happens often is when we deal with difficult questions in life, do I take this job? Do I move to this city? Do I do this thing? Is that those things loom so large over us that we miss the things that you have to still do. So what this practically looks like, a good example would be, if you got a promotion at work this week, would that be a good thing? Probably, right? Most of you would say, I'd love to get a promotion at work this week. I'd love to come in. I'd love to get a promotion. I'd love to get a pay raise, right? Because right, if your boss calls you in tomorrow morning and says, hey, you've been doing a good job, and we want to promote you, and we want to give you this new position, and it's come with this big bump and an extra vacation, all these other things, all these perks, right? The initial response is, well, absolutely, that's a good thing, and you're going to want to receive that. What I'm saying is, when that comes, there are other factors that you must factor in other than more responsibility and more pay. What might cause you to take an opportunity that's been given to you and reject it? Why would a husband and a father be offered a promotion and a pay raise? Why might he not take that job? Right? So maybe this comes from a 40-hour week, and now there's an expectation you're working 55, 60, 70-hour weeks. What else? Right. It might be moving your family away from healthy churches, away from the structure that helps to care for your family and the relationships that you have. That might be relocation. What else?
Might involve responsibility that would come in conflict with your commitment to the Lord.
Yeah, it might mean that to take this job means you're gone every weekend. And you're not going to be able to be with your church family ever, right? It's not that you're traveling occasionally, but you're traveling. This job is going to put you on the road every week, and it is going to be rare that you're ever going to be able to be with your church family. What else? Yeah, right? There might be things, given your role, given that position, wherever the company is, that you might have to violate your conscience to step into that role, right? I give this example to say, this is how we ought to think through these things, right? That it's not, we often think the open door is a good door. If it's open, we always go through it. And I would say wisdom says we need to first consider what are the non-negotiables, right? There are a ton of people who I think are going to hit retirement age, and they're going to go back and wish they could give some of that money back to have some of the time. They're going to go back and wish they could have been with their kids more. And yeah, right, they took good vacations, they lived in a nice house, they drove nice cars, their kids didn't want for anything, they had money, they lived comfortable lives. But they're going to wish, when they hit retirement age, they're going to wish that they could go back and they would give all that money back to go back and to have that time with their family. Right, the part is, what are my non-negotiables? If I get offered a position that is going to significantly hinder my ability to care for my wife and kids, to be with them, to be present in their lives, hinder my ability to be with the body, to worship with my fellow believers, to serve the body, to do the things I need to do there. Right? There might be real reasons that you look at a promotion and say, that's not for me. I'm going to turn that down despite more money, despite more responsibility, despite a nicer title, because I have these non-negotiables that are preventing me from doing that. So when we think about our role in the world, right, you're not going to find a scripture that you can turn to when you get that promotion that says, thou shalt not take the promotion, or thou shalt take it. It's a wisdom issue, and one of the ways you need to consider is, what are the non-negotiables for me? What is it that God has called me to do? And if stepping into roles would cause me to not be able to fulfill my non-negotiables, then it's a non-starter, right? Then it's just something we're not going to do if it's going to violate what I know for sure I've already been called to do. So the same goes for women. As we think through what sort of roles should we step into, right? You think through wives and mothers and women who aren't married but are single and are members of the church and followers of Jesus. They have non-negotiables. What does it look like for them? They've got to consider those first before they step into any outside role outside of the home and outside of the church. We have these big rocks that we deal with first, and then we can begin to think about the other things. Does that make sense? Right? So again, maybe it feels like I'm just dancing around and not drawing any hard lines. It's because I think their hard lines are difficult to draw in this arena. I want to give you lenses to try to think through these things. So we want to remember our created dispositions. Consider the specific roles that we've been given in church and in home and how those might apply to the broader culture. And then consider our particular stewardships and responsibility. What is it that God has called me to do? I think a great example, if you go to Proverbs 31, we'll look at this quickly. How this might play out in the life of individuals might be very different, right? So that maybe you go in tomorrow and you get offered a promotion and you decide not to take it. You look at your bandwidth, you look at your capacity, and you say, for me to step into that role, it's going to severely hamper yes, I'll make more money, but I'm going to double my hours at work. I'm going to miss more ball games. I'm not going to be there with the kids to do bedtime. I'm not going to be there to do breakfast and help them get ready. I'm not going to be at church. I'm going to be traveling. Maybe you look at it and you say, hey, that is going to push me beyond my capacity to do the things I know I need to do, so I'm going to turn it down, right? Everybody has different capacities, right? There's a pastor I know that's a full-time pastor of a church and a full-time seminary professor and dean. He's got a different capacity than most people, right? His max capacity is higher. He's got a bigger bucket than most people, right? God has not created us all with the same capacities, right? So that what might cause you to max out may not be true for somebody else. And what you have margin for may not be the case for somebody else who doesn't have as much margin. So when we say, we look at, what does this look like for us in the home? We think about, what are the non-negotiables? What does it look like for a wife to do these things or a man to do these things? I think Proverbs 31 is a great example, is that sometimes this is going to look different, right? You read, what does the Proverbs 31 woman do? Let's read, go down to verse 15. Or sorry, go to verse 10. We'll start there. An excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. So this is a tremendous woman, right? She does good for her husband. What are the sort of things she does? She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands, right? She's building things. She's working with her hands. She is like the ship of the merchants and brings her food from afar. She goes out. She purchases food. She brings it in. She rises while it is yet night. She's getting up really early and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She's taking care of people. She considers a field and buys it. She executes a real estate deal, right? She considers a field and she buys it, and with the fruit of her hand, she plants a vineyard. She's tending to the ground. Verse 17, she dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable, right? She's selling things. Her lamp does not go out at night. She gets up early. She stays up late. She puts her hands to the staff and puts her hands to the spindles. She's sewing. She's putting things together. She's generous. She opens her hands to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. She makes bed coverings for herself. Her cloth is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She delivers sashes to the merchant. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She's prepared. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. Read that because I think some have thought about gender, masculinity and femininity in the world and what this looks like, and I think they have drawn lines that are so small that the Proverbs 31 woman would not fit in them. Right? I think there are people who look at this and say, and again, I think they've drawn a small circle and say, this little thing that I'm saying right here, this is the only way that a woman should act in her home and in the world. Right? She's to never work outside the home. She is only to be in the home. She is to, right? She doesn't need to know about the money. Right? It's the husband who's going to do all those things. That she is to own that. That is her. That she is to wait hand and foot on her husband and her kids, and that's her role. And to which I would say, well, that's not what the Proverbs 31 woman does. Right? We saw a ton of stuff. She's going out. She's selling things. She's working the markets. She buys a field and plants it. She's preparing for the future. She's dealing with finances. She's doing all sorts of things. I don't want to draw a smaller circle than Proverbs 31 draws. Right? Again, in your own home, these things might work out differently. Everybody's going to come to have different convictions on some of these things. But as we think through, that's why there are folks who say, man, a woman should always stay at home, or a woman should always go to work and help to provide for the family. I just would say those are darker lines that I'm willing to draw. Right? Again, it's wisdom. It's thinking through what are our dispositions? What are we called to do? What is my capacity? Right? I think if you're a husband whose wife is considering, hey, I might want to stay at home or I might want to work, I think you need to have conversations about, well, what is your capacity, right? Maybe you're a husband who has your wife stayed at home and she's thinking about, man, I think maybe I'd like to go back to work. All right, well, we need to have some conversations about why do we want to go back to work? What will we do with the extra money? What does that look like for our kids, right? What is your capacity? What can you take on or not take on? If you take on this thing, what other things might you have to give up for us to do this, right? It's weighing all these things out and then seeking the Lord in that and trying to come to a wise decision to seek to honor God. It's keeping all of these pieces, all of these, in a sense, all these plates spinning, right? It's trying to keep in mind all of these distinctions that God has given us and seeking to honor the Lord and getting wise counsel from other people. If you're thinking through these things, go talk to somebody. Ask somebody else. Go to somebody that you've seen do it well. And say, tell me how this has worked for you, right? Go to somebody who their wife worked outside the home for the entirety of their kids. Go back and say, hey, tell me how you did that. What'd you do that you would do again? What'd you do that you would do differently? What do you wish you had done that you didn't do? Go to somebody that their wife never worked outside the home and say, hey, tell me how you did that. Tell me what you would do differently. Tell me what do I need to know as I think through these things. It's getting wisdom from folks as we think through these things. Last piece I'll give you. You'll see there under applying these conditions, you could sum it up this way, that we ought to pursue endeavors that seem consistent with your identity and responsibility as a man or a woman, rather than endeavors that might undermine or suppress them. Seeking to stay in what God has called us to. So in whatever position or endeavor you find yourself, do your best to express it in a way that embraces and upholds your God-given masculinity, or for the ladies who aren't in here, God-given femininity, right? We're seeking to affirm and to stay in the lane that God has called us, not to undermine or suppress the way that God has called us to be men. So think about the type of authority that a job involves, right? So can you work as a man? Can you work in a job where your boss is a wife, or where your boss is a female? Can you work in a job where your boss is a woman? Yeah, I think so. I think you can. I don't think there's anything in the scriptures that would prohibit you working at a job where your manager or your boss or your owner is a woman. Right? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think you're violating any principles. But part of that means is you're still a man there. You still ought to have, even when you're under authority, you still ought to have in your mind, in your heart, a disposition that says you want to pour out your life for the sake of others. You want to provide for others. You ought to be, again, we said this, I think, week 1. Christian men ought to be the best employees on the planet. Right? Because of our disposition, we ought to be those who always are looking to care for other people. Consider how to express yourself as an employee or an employer in distinctly masculine or feminine ways. Again, wherever you go there as a man. You don't get to leave that at the door. God has put you together in specific, particular ways, and so we operate in the world in those ways. So I'll sum it all up this way. I am cautious to draw really hard lines about offices in the world that women can hold or shouldn't hold, or that men can hold or shouldn't hold. I tend to think that most offices in the world, most roles in the broader culture are open to men and women, given a consideration of wisdom. Again, if I were a bricklayer and I needed people to come lay bricks, probably I'd hire a lot more men than I would women, right? Not because I hate women, but because there are distinctions between men and women, right? If I'm deciding who needs to go on the front line and put themselves in the line of danger, right? I want to put men there. I don't want to put women there. Right? I'm thinking through those things. That disposition still matters, right? When it's public office, disposition still matters. Men and women are different. It doesn't mean that one is better or worse. It just means that they're different. And so we think through those things. So maybe you think, man, Chris, you have just like wiffle waffled this whole time. You're not giving us any clear lines about what this looks like in society. What I want to give you is just principles, things, ways, lenses to try to think through these things as you consider, should a man hold this job or should a woman hold this job? It's a wisdom issue we want to think through, and then what are the things we should be thinking of? Our disposition, as God has made us, the distinct roles that God has given us, the non-negotiables that he's given us, what is it that we're called to do as men or women, and how would operating in this way affect what I know God has called me to do, and then that helps me to know, at least with some clarity, what things might be open to me or not open to me. All right, questions before I go. Yeah, the context changes, right? If we go back to the example of the man taking or not taking the promotion, the age of his kids probably makes a big difference there. It's a different thing having really young kids at home versus having kids that are much older, that are close to out of the house. There's a big difference there that might really change the calculation there of what sort of capacity do I have as my kids are, maybe our kids are out of the house, right? There's a different thing. You're right. These things are going to change as context changes. All right, anybody else? Speak now, or well, I'll see you again, so you don't have to hold it forever. All right, I'm gonna pass these out, and then what I want you to do is just get with 3-4 people who are around you, and I want to spend some time these last 20 or so, 25 minutes. You're going to end praying for each other, right? Something I really want to make sure that we did in this class is that is to pray for each other, to ask the Lord to bless our lives, to bless our families, to bless our ministries, to bless us, to help us to be men who honor the Lord and to serve him well. So what I want you to do is to sort of just gather with the 3 or 4 people that are around you. Chris you're not gonna make it through all these. I'm gonna give you the first one. What I want you to do is take a couple minutes, discuss amongst your small group, and then you'll come, Chris will call you back. You'll talk sort of together through some of these things, and then he'll send you back out with another question to sort of think through. I've given you them so you can look at them. Chris will direct you which ones you'll think through. But I just want to spend some time thinking through how do these things apply to us, give you some chance to talk to each other. Again, every man in this room, all of your contexts are different. Right? Whether you're married or single or got kids or not kids, even you married guys, none of you, hopefully, you're married to the same woman. Right? So your marriages are all different. Right? Your kids are different. Your jobs are different. So it's helpful for us to learn from and to glean wisdom from each other as we seek to live faithfully. So I'm gonna give you the first question, which is this: what aspect of biblical manhood do you find most difficult to live out in the midst of our culture? So given our sort of current culture and the way gender is talked about and thought about, what aspect of manhood? Maybe you don't find any of them difficult, but if so, what aspect do you find most difficult? Wouldn't you say, man, in the current culture, I find it hard to live out manhood in this way. I find this particular aspect difficult to do given current culture. So get with 3 or 4 people who are around you, discuss that, and then Chris will pull you back up here in just a minute. Thank you guys for hanging with me for 6 weeks. I appreciate you. It was a fun class to teach. I'll see you in service.